All right, hello and welcome to Jazz Appreciation. Welcome back to Jazz Appreciation. This week we're going to be taking a look at the Bebop Era. Bebop Era, okay, is prior to the 1950s, I believe. Sorry, prior to the 1970s, okay, sorry, it is around the 1950s. And let's take a look. Let's dive in. As always, ladies and gentlemen, you can find this presentation and the slides on our Google Classroom. So if you'd like to dive a little deeper in depth into what we've been studying for this week, have a look at those slide presentations, please. All right, so bebop and jam sessions. Now, there's a lot of information in these slides, folks, and I'm not going to read everything because, quite frankly, that would be boring. But we're going to talk about some of the key things here. So, in the mid-1940s, bebop, or simply bop, represented a turning away from jazz as a popular music, part of the mainstream of American culture, to a music that is isolated, not danceable, so people cannot quite dance to it, played by small combo groups to a small audience in these virtuosic styles. Okay, small groups, virtuosic styles, very, very artful, very artsy in terms of musical composition. Now, there are two ways to view this change. One labels bebop as revolutionary, something new, something out there, something apart from the jazz that preceded it, that came before it. The other view that I'm going to be talking about sees bebop as evolutionary, not revolutionary. So it's just simply the evolution of jazz, something that naturally was going to progress, and that it is part of the jazz tradition that made it into an art music and linked it to the preceding swing era that we talked about last week. Dropping bombs at Minton's. So we're going to talk about Minton's. So swing musicians started work in the evening and continued to play after their regular gigs at jam sessions, which were relaxing in their informality, but work-like in their competitiveness. Musicians kept experienced players off the bandstand, so off the stage, by playing tunes at ridiculously fast tempos, in keys that they didn't quite know. Now, standards, so the head tunes, these main tunes, like I Got Rhythm, were reharmonized from the swing era into this era with difficult chord substitutions. And so bebop musicians were continually testing, confronting these fast tempos and complicated harmonies, taking these standard tunes from the swing era and evolving them. Here we've got Minton's Playhouse. Okay, it opened for business in 1940, and by 1947 was very famous as the birthplace of bebop. Okay, and here on the left, we've got Thelonious Monk, very famous piano player. We've got trumpeter Howard McGhee and Roy Eldridge, who we'll talk about. And then the band leader here is Teddy Hill. So Charlie Parker, very, very famous jazz musician, who we have talked about, and other beboppers played jam sessions at Minton's Playhouse. Okay, this is in New York, in Manhattan, a venue at the forefront of experimentation. So it's a place where jazz musicians could come and play without being scrutinized, without being torn down because of this new style, the new way of playing. And we get this guy named Kenny Clark. He's a drummer, and he relates how he changed the drumming while playing a fast tune with Teddy Hill's band. And remember, in the photo before is Teddy Hill's band. He couldn't play every quarter note on the bass drum. It was just simply too fast. So he started keeping the beat on the ride cymbal instead, producing a much higher, more flexible way of keeping time and leaving the bass drum available for fills and to color the music and to really push those soloists. So when Hill's band collapsed, Minton offered him the job of running the music at the clubhouse, at the playhouse. And in terms of running the music, he was able to bring in some very popular young and up-to-tempo drummers such as Max Roach and especially Art Blakey. Now, soloists. Remember, soloists or improvisationists is when someone is playing on their own with a little bit of accompaniment from the piano and maybe the bass and tempo keeping from the drums. But it's one instrumentalist playing at the same time. And these soloists played unpredictable melodies. Melodies that were inspired by Lester Young that are very hard to memorize and very hard and difficult to go away humming. Right? They jumped, they bebopped all around. Okay, piano players who were inspired by Count Basie, as we've talked about, started comping. Okay, or accompanying, which is where we get the word comping from. Okay, where these accompanists, such as the piano players, the bass players, and the percussionists, the drummers, would comp. They would play chords. They would add color to the rest of the band without simply just keeping time. So here we have Kenny Clarke, a very famous drummer of the bebop era, and he devised new techniques in playing swing music, but he took those techniques and really evolved them and modernized them into this bebop era. And he would play forever. Hours-long jam sessions, calloused fingers, and very sore limbs after these sessions. But he would play, and anybody could jam with him, and he didn't mind people jamming with him. Now, people say that nobody plays those types of changes. Now, where did this come from? Well, bebop is characterized by complex and very dissonant or not so great sounding, not pleasing sounding, to the ears, sounding harmonies to the ears. And although these types of things were disliked by many musicians, because you have to remember that old school swing musicians were trained as classical musicians, and so the idea of dissonance to them, they didn't quite like them, and they didn't quite like the complex nature of bebop style of music, because they liked those nice harmonies coming back from their classical roots, their classical training. And so we get musicians like Art Tatum, Duke Ellington, and Coleman Hawkins, who revolutionized or evolved these harmonies into what they are even to today. The problem here was how do they share these harmonies so that other musicians could use them, so that other musicians could actually play them? Because these rhythms, these types of harmonies, this dissonance, the runs, the tempo, were exceptionally complex, and not a lot of musicians could play them. And so you get these three main musicians, Art Tatum, Duke Ellington, and Coleman Hawkins, who really wanted to try to make this type of music, bebop style of music, available and playable to all. And so this music is characterized by the common use of tritones, which a lot of classical players understand. And this approach made improvising way more difficult, but if classical musicians understood the tritones, these classically trained jazz musicians, then it was easier for them to play them, because they had to learn to tackle the music intellectually, which many of these classically trained musicians were able to do because they had the theory knowledge behind them, but they had to learn the emotions of jazz, right? It coming from the blues, from the heart, right? Not just simply notes on a page. We get this Bop City, right? A very jumping place. Okay, huge music hall in San Francisco, very crowded place, very popular. And as you can see on the right here, you can actually see his name carved in, Dizzy Gillespie. Okay, very famous piano and trumpet player, more known for his trumpet playing. And you also get Miles Davis. Okay, his head is bowed to his right, so you get Miles Davis here. Okay. You also get singer Betty Bennett is here as well, right in the middle. Okay, and you get saxophonist Jimmy Heath. Okay, he's facing the camera directly below her. So we got this guy, Jimmy. Okay, and we get all these very, very famous musicians playing at Bop City, right? These kind of big hall music playhouses where people could go and listen, could go and dance, could really fill the place with a very energetic vibe. And this is from 1951. Now, racial and economic forces were driving musicians out of swing. These non-musical forces form the basis of the revolutionary view of bebop. During the swing era, African American musicians could not get lucrative jobs playing for radio orchestras. There was still this racial divide, and they couldn't get lengthy engagements at the top New York ballrooms and dance halls. They couldn't get jobs in these places because, unfortunately, the owners of these and the managers of these music halls and playhouses were generally white or Caucasian people, typically men, who were still conflicted in terms of the idea of African American musicians coming to play in their clubs. And so most black bands or African American bands were forced onto the road, playing in much smaller venues, making much less money, and not really getting their sound out there in terms of a wider audience that could be given in these bigger clubs and bigger playhouses. Now musicians became bitter and exhausted because of this, traveling all over the place, and there was this increasingly void that was left. In terms of the music, and these big bands really didn't have a lot of playing time at this time. And so bebop, this new evolution of music, evolution of jazz music, provided a site where they could go and explore their music outside of that traditional system. Because these big bands, these swing bands, the popularity of swing was declining here. And by the early 1940s, a new jazz based on chromatic harmonies and interactive rhythm sections was in place. The Bebop era was fully in place in the early 1940s. Right? Soloists and this idea of the virtuoso musician, right? Someone who could play many notes very, very quickly, could become quite popular. And that was the style of the day. Now we're just going to move into some of the musicians. I'm not going to go into in-depth detail, but we're going to talk very briefly about them. We get Charlie Parker, also known as Bird or Birdman. He's considered among the best alto saxophonists in jazz history. Grew up in Kansas City and received his nickname after he provided a yard bird. This is a dinner in the form of a run-over chicken to his bandmates during a trip to a gig. But the name Bird also resonated with the sense of taking flight, right? His speed and his agility in playing the saxophone could be matched by no other jazz musician. And so, as he's playing these very fast notes, right, he could play very quickly and up and down these scales. And so it gave the music this idea of uplifting spirit, this flight of the music. And so the nickname Bird or Birdman stood the test of time because of that as well. So here is Charlie Parker. Very, very famous. And beside him we get Miles Davis as well. Very, very famous trumpet player, and he's very young at this point in time. A little bit more about Charlie Parker. I'm not going to go into detail here. You can read it for yourself on the slides. But now we move into Dizzy Gillespie. Very famous piano and trumpet player, more so for the trumpet than anything. And he could do what Charlie Parker could do on the saxophone, but Dizzy Gillespie could do it on the trumpet, which was very, very difficult to do, playing fast run of notes. It was very, very challenging to do. So just YouTube or Google Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, and you'll find some phenomenal tunes. Here they are playing at the Onyx Club. This This was probably one of the very first bebop bands in 1943. You've got Dizzy Gillespie here. You've also got Max Roach on the drums. Okay, very famous drummer. As well, you've got who else we have? Oscar Pettiford on the bass. Very, very great bassist. And Bud Johnson on the tenor saxophone. But here it's Dizzy Gillespie on the trumpet. That is the kind of the famous name here at the Onyx Club. And so this combo band, you could be considered the first bebop band in history. Excuse me. A little bit more about Dizzy Gillespie. I'm not going to go into that, but you can read it for yourself. So we've got Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie. The band's playing on 52nd Street. Now, 52nd Street, so this is in New York. Okay, the Onyx Club, which is on 52nd Street, was home to numerous different musicians, playing with different people from all over the United States. We've got Earl Hines as being one of those big band leaders at the time. Okay, who played with Gillespie and Parker as well. And so when you've got Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and Earl Hines together, you've got kind of that quintessential bebop music musicians at the time. And so here we got another photo of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. Now Dizzy Gillespie was very famed for having the goatee, as you can see here. He never really got rid of it. Kept the goatee for quite some time. And then we also have here on the right a very, very young John Coltrane. And we've talked about John Coltrane. And he's a very good tenor saxophone player who is quite influential in his time. And so these big name musicians were all playing together, and they were evolving, not necessarily revolutionizing the music, but they were evolving the music of the time from jazz into this new period of bebop music. Remember, bebop was inspired by jazz, and it evolved from jazz. I don't agree with the term of revolution or the revolutionizing of swing music into bebop. I think it truly is an evolution because they're still using the basic standards from the swing era in this new style of music. The first bebop recordings date from 1945 and were made mostly by small independent labels. Okay, for record companies, this was a very low-cost way to get into the business because bebop musicians regularly created new melodies over these old chord progressions that the public, that the listeners that bought these albums and that listened to the radio often recognized and really liked. And so that's why it truly is an evolution and not a revolution, because it's taking these old standards and just building upon them or evolving them. Okay, let's keep moving. Okay, we've got, like I said, Dizzy Gillespie. Okay, he didn't like drugs, and he showed how bebop could act as a foundation for the professional jazz musician. And jazz musicians of today truly took the styles of the bebop era, and they still even use those styles from bebop. And so Gillespie was one of those musicians who said, you know what? We need to create this music right now. We need to solidify what we are doing in terms of recording, in terms of getting the sound out there, in terms of teaching people how to improvise and how to use, right, the standards of bebop. And because he did that, because he created that foundation, we still use bebop standards and some certain styles from the bebop era today in modern day jazz. Now, Gillespie, very famous, like I said, trumpet player, and this is one of his most famed pictures. You'll see many different versions of this picture with the trumpet bell bent upward. Now, the instrument is not designed like this. As you know, a trumpet bell is set and standard, right? It's straight. There's no bending of the bell like that, like you see in this picture. But one night in 1953, there was an accident on stage that pushed Dizzy Gillespie's trumpet bell upward. Now, realizing that this new design compensated for a very lifetime habit of looking down while playing, right? Trumpet players, you should not be looking down. You should look straight ahead. Gillespie asked the trumpet manufacturers for all of his trumpets to make his horns this way. And this became his signature look, especially when playing the trumpet. Now, as bebop and bop jazz music declined in the 1950s, Dizzy Gillespie still remained drug-free and very generous in terms of his earnings, and very generous in sharing his music and his musical style with the public. He kept his big band active for many, many years while nurturing the careers of many young jazz musicians. He traveled overseas for the government at the time, and he was very openly vocal in terms of how African Americans were being treated in the United States and how race relations needed to come together. That there shouldn't be there should not be this segregation or this divide between different races in the United States. And because of that, because of his efforts in bringing that together. Now, it wasn't perfect, and he didn't completely bring this divide together. It didn't close the gap completely. But he allowed musicians, both Caucasian and African American, and he allowed his sound to influence what these club owners would allow in their clubs. And he really did revolutionize the availability of jazz music from all different races in these big name clubs in New York and in California and in Chicago as well. Okay, Dizzy Gillespie eventually became a jazz celebrity, and he continued to explore music, and he really did become one of our elder statesmen of jazz. And he unfortunately died in 1993. An entire generation of young musicians started playing bop. Okay, we get Fats Navarro, who's a very good trumpet player. We get Sonny Stitt, okay, playing saxophone. Very famous people. But as we move into the 1950s and 1960s, right, drugs and alcohol became prevalent in the jazz scene, and you get a lot of jazz musicians really losing their chops and dying early, from drug use and alcohol and substance abuse. Because these elder statesmen of jazz kind of they weren't there to influence these young musicians in terms of the lifestyles and the moral lifestyles that they led. They influenced them greatly in terms of their music, but their moral lifestyles and the way they led their lives, they weren't as influenced in, unfortunately. We get Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young, two of the greatest saxophone players ever in jazz music, were influenced by these early foundational bebop jazz artists, especially for those two, for Hawkins and Young. They would have taken a lot of their styles from Charlie Parker. Here we get Bud Powell. Okay, Bud Powell, he transferred bebop's electric pace to the piano, right? Bebop style was really about the saxophone and really about the trumpet, and so Bud Powell said, hey guys, what about the piano? And so he took that very fast-paced, virtuosic, dissonant harmonization of bebop and put it into the piano. Bebop also was played on the West Coast, so it is primarily an East Coast art form at this time, at the early 1940s, okay, in New York, but it did travel to the West Coast as well, to Los Angeles, as well as to New Orleans. We also now get Dexter Gordon, very famous famous jazz musician, and we actually have a number of Dexter Gordon's tunes in our music library at Croxford. But Dexter Gordon came from the middle class. Okay, his family were very affluent musicians and loved music. And initially, as we've seen in these early jazz musicians, they all studied classical music to begin with. And Dexter Gordon studied the clarinet and then the saxophone in high school, which is actually the typical route for saxophone players even to this day. You start with clarinet and then you move on to high school, just to the saxophone later on, even maybe perhaps in the later middle school years and the very, very early jazz high school years. Coleman Hawkins, Dexter Gordon saw Coleman Hawkins as a master, but he was initially inspired by Lester Young. Studied music theory with Dizzy Gillespie and later encountered Charlie Parker and his style of bebop playing. And Dexter Gordon really ran away with that. Okay, here's Dexter Gordon playing the tenor saxophone. And he was once told by Miles Davis, "It ain't got nothing to do with money. It's got something to do with the hipness." Remember, bebop style, right? This hip style of jazz. Musicians played for the style. They played for the audience. They played to get their sound out there. And many musicians, those top musicians of this time, Dexter Gordon, Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, Lester Young, Dizzy Gillespie, they were playing not to make money. They were playing to share what they know, to evolve the style of jazz, to evolve and keep jazz in the ears, in the homes, in the clubs, and to keep people listening to jazz and really making sure that it didn't just simply die off. For a brief time in the 1940s, bebop was marketed as popular music, okay, to keep that style of jazz alive. While swing music began to fade away, began to become less popular. But it failed as pop music. It failed truly as popular music. But musicians saw it as a musical system that became, like I said, the foundation of jazz music even to this day. We get Norman Granz, okay? Very, very tough, okay? Determined producer and musician to try and get this sound out there and to solidify the music of the time. And to wrap up, here are just some additional listings for you to take a listen to once you finish this video. Please take a look at this song here, Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, Sweet Georgia Brown, recorded in 1943. Cab Calloway is also quite a famous jazz musician, bebop era musician of this time. Like I said, we've got Gillespie and Charlie Parker. Take a look at Dexter Gordon's Love for Sale from 1962. Very, very good. And you can actually take a look at Bud Powell's piano playing and his very fast-paced, virtuosic piano bebop style of playing in Hallucinations and Un Poco Loco, both recorded in 1951. Okay, the important thing here to remember, ladies and gentlemen, is though musicians continued to learn the bebop style, many new stylistic directions took off from this based on different aesthetics, so what was popular and what people liked at the time. And as racial politics evolved, especially in the United States, new styles of music started to appear. And we're going to take a look at that, those true evolutionary styles of music that evolved not only from swing music, but evolved from bebop music and the style of bebop past the 1950s. All right, so we're getting closer and closer to modern day jazz music. And we're going to be taking a look at music of the 1970s next week. So, as always, if you have any questions, folks, please feel free to email me at any time. And don't forget to answer this week's discussion question. I truly look forward to our discussion this week. Have a wonderful week ahead, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.